ArcfieldWeather.com meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Tuesday morning, November the 18th. A very interesting weather pattern going forward, both in the near term and in the longer term. We'll kind of start off here with an update on the longer term factors that we're taking a look at, and then we'll focus in on a low pressure area that is now over the Midwest. It will head to the east later today into the Mid-Atlantic region, bringing some beneficial rainfall to the Mid-Atlantic, but in some areas it'll be cold enough and dry enough for some snowflakes to mix in, especially north of the Pennsylvania-Maryland border. But let's first start off with a look at the longer term here. One of the phrases you'll hear quite often, I think, in coming days is polar vortex or stratospheric warming. So we wanted to go through a little bit of a discussion on that here at the onset of this video discussion. First of all, this is a graphic put out by NOAA that has a depiction of what we could call the stable, the normal polar vortex here on the left side of this plot, and then a disrupted polar vortex. Typically, you'll have low pressure in the stratosphere centered over the North Pole region during the winter time. And notice the winds flow counterclockwise around low pressure areas. So think of a low right over here, right over the pole, as the normal situation. So just to the south there, you'll generally have a westerly wind flow. I want to point this out because it'll kind of make the next plot I show a little bit more understandable. Expect to see a westerly wind flow here. Oh, we're looking at around 60 degrees north latitude. Anchorage is right around there for an example. But in a normal polar vortex situation, you'll have westerly winds at that latitude, again, just on the south side of the polar vortex. Now, if you have what we call a stratospheric warming event or a disruption in the polar vortex, the upper air wind flow can buckle. It can become, as you see here depicted on this particular graph here, basically in this situation here, cold air tends to be bottled up over the polar region. But if you have a disruption in that stratospheric polar vortex, that could send some cold air masses from the high latitudes to the middle latitudes, both on this side of the North Pole and on the other side of the North Pole. Indeed, any kind of a polar air mass that moves in any direction will be a southward movement. So again, a disruption in the polar vortex, which could happen with a stratospheric warming event, can send some cold air masses from the high latitudes into the middle latitudes of the U.S., for example, or Europe, or into Asia on the other side of the pole. Indeed, it looks like we will have a stratospheric warming event, which is certainly not unprecedented, but it is quite rare for this early in the winter season. Some of the reports I've seen, the last stratospheric warming event in the month of November was all the way back to November of 1968. So it does look like we'll have some semblance of a stratospheric warming event towards the end of this month, really later next week. And we'll show a map in a moment. But again, this is a typical situation here when you have an undisturbed polar vortex sitting right on the North Pole region here. But this is the buckling in the upper level wind flow that can happen with a weakening of the polar vortex, a stretching of the polar vortex, or any kind of a displacement onto one side of the pole or another. Well, here's an interesting plot I alluded to a moment ago with respect to those normal westerly winds around 60 degrees when you have a stable stratospheric polar vortex. This is a plot going forward into the month of December by a recent model run of what we call the zonal mean wind. Now, zonal refers to a west to east flow. That is, again, a typical flow with a stable polar vortex at around 60 degrees north. This is for 60 degrees north here going forward, this zonal mean wind here, way up at the top of the atmosphere, the stratospheric level at 10 millibars. And this particular line right here is of interest because this is when what this is saying is when the winds end up right around zero here, that is saying that those westerly winds weaken, almost weaken to the point of a reversal. In fact, if you get down into negative territory, that westerly wind tends to become an easterly wind or a reversal. And all this is suggesting that we have stratospheric warming, because again, this is a good indication that that stable polar vortex position will be changing, because that westerly wind at 60 degrees north is going away. And what's interesting about this particular forecast is really an extended period here of weak to no westerly component to the wind here at 60 degrees north. This goes all the way into the end of the first week of December. So that's telling us that not only will we have a stratospheric warming event, but it can be kind of an extended stratospheric warming event. Again, not too common to see a stratospheric warming event this early in the winter season. And if indeed this zonal mean wind at 10 millibars reaches zero, then technically it classifies as a stratospheric warming event. But whether it comes closer or actually hits that zero mark here, it looks like indeed we'll have stratospheric warming. And that can have an impact really for the next several weeks in terms of unleashing some cold air masses from way up there in northern Canada southward into the central and eastern U.S. So we've kind of covered the stratospheric warming event that is certainly in the works here, it looks like, later this month going into the early part of December. I want to also take a look at tropical forcing, or the MJO, with respect to the longer range outlook here. But before we leave the topic of stratospheric warming, let me just point out that at arcfieldweather.com, you can go to the Meteorology 101 page here and just scroll down. There's a whole series of videos with kind of deeper discussions in these particular topics. For example, the EPO, we've been talking about that lately. As you keep scrolling down, you can look at high latitude blocking here, and a little farther down here we have specifically designed for the stratospheric warming phenomenon. It's quite interesting indeed. I go through some historic examples. Just as a quick example here, in 1985, we go all the way back to the end of 1984 into 1985. We had a stratospheric warming event during December of that year, and it took several weeks, but by the latter part of January, we had sort of a very, very cold air moving into the eastern U.S. In fact, some of you may remember, if you're as old as I am, that Ronald Reagan's second inauguration on January 20th of 1985, they had all kinds of outdoor activities planned in the D.C. area. They were all called off because it was so cold on January 20th, 1985, and that was as a result of a stratospheric warming event that really got underway in December of 1984, and a lot of that is described in this particular video discussion. Now, again, looking ahead here, another factor certainly been closely monitored is what we call the tropical forcing, or the MJO, the Madden-Julian oscillation. This is a plot that we show frequently here at arcfieldweather.com, and it kind of shows the movement of a tropical disturbance that propagates on a regular basis along the equator. And in fact, I'll show in a moment here what these particular phases or locations actually look like on a map here. This is what we call phase 7, phase 8, and then phase 1 here. We have kind of a description: Western Pacific, or Western Hemisphere, and Africa, Indian Ocean, as to kind of a more specific description as to what these locations or phases mean with respect to the MJO. And the way to look at this kind of a plot is that the MJO rotates in a counterclockwise fashion. So this is a forecast map from a recent European model run going all the way out to December 17th. And the bottom line here is after it kind of stalls out in this particular location here later this month, the MJO will then move counterclockwise through phase 7, and it looks like into phase 8 by the time we get to the middle of December. And this is a cold phase, as is phase 1 for this time of the year. Phase 7 is actually relatively cold too, but maybe not quite as cold as phases 8 and 1. In other words, in years past, when we see the MJO rotating into phase 8 and phase 1, we've seen colder than normal conditions across much of the central and eastern U.S. So this is a favorable sign for a colder pattern for much of the eastern two-thirds of the nation as we go through the month of December. The fact that the MJO looks like it will rotate into these colder phases over the next few weeks. This, again, is something we'll monitor closely here at arcfieldweather.com. By the way, if the MJO kind of moves into this center circle, it becomes a weaker and weaker influence. In other words, if the MJO ends up in this area, then it will have little or no impact on the weather across the eastern U.S. But this is pretty far away right now from this inner circle here, or what we can call kind of a neutral signal in here. So if in fact it does the opposite, it starts rotating a little farther away, that means it becomes a stronger and stronger signal, and will have more and more of an impact on the weather across the eastern United States, as an example. Now, I mentioned those phases or locations. Again, the MJO kind of tracks a tropical disturbance that propagates regularly on a regular basis across the equator. These are those particular phases on this particular map. It ends up going all the way out here and then really comes back around on a pretty regular basis. That's why we call it an oscillation. But just to give it kind of an idea as to what we're talking about when we're looking at phases or different locations of the MJO. Again, all of this is kind of tracking a complex of thunderstorms that tends to oscillate on a pretty regular basis here. And this time of the year, the November, December, January time period, when the MJO gets out in this area right here, that tends to be lead to colder than normal weather across much of the eastern half of the nation. And right now, that seems to be the forecast of numerous computer forecast models, and we'll, of course, track this over the next few weeks. Now, one last plot I'd like to show with respect to the MJO. This is actually last winter season, going from the end of 2024 into the first part of 2025. Again, this is the MJO as it appeared last winter, all the way from December 1st into the latter part of January. This is the December 1st, 2024, where the MJO was. And notice here, for the bulk of December and into the month of January, it was in what we call the warmer phases of 5 and 6 here, and it ends up going from all the way into these phases, but not until the latter part of the winter season. So we had this stage of last winter, the MJO was indeed in warmer phases compared to what it looks like we'll be in late November into the early part of December. So quite a difference from a year ago with respect to that tropical forcing. Well, one last thing I'd like to mention before we get to the current weather situation, which is very interesting indeed. Again, if you go back to the arcfieldweather.com website and go to our winter outlook here, the seasonal outlooks, and click on the winter outlook. And one of the things I want to mention, we won't go through it right now, but we kind of highlight the importance of yet another one of these teleconnection indices known as the quasi-biennial oscillation. And that has to do with respect to the tropospheric winds in the stratosphere. And here we have a discussion at the winter outlook here for this particular year at the arcfieldweather.com. And just wanted to point out that we're in a negative phase here, and this tends to increase the chance for stratospheric warming events when you combine it with the La Nina. So we really talked about this in the winter outlook. So if you want to take a look at that also, that teleconnection in this right here, when an easterly or negative phase of the QBO is combined with a La Nina, as we currently have experiencing right now in the Pacific Ocean, there's a strong tendency for an increase in sudden stratospheric warming events and the disruption of the polar vortex. So this looks like it is coming to fruition here. We are certainly still in a negative QBO, and it looks like it will continue into the winter season. So this is just another kind of a confirmation, or at least supporting evidence that we may indeed have a sudden stratospheric warming event, and the short-term models certainly indicate that as well. So certainly take a look back at the winter outlook for a detailed description of the QBO. Well, let's now focus in on the latest radar, the current weather situation. We have a storm system over the Midwest. Pretty healthy support. We'll take a look at this in a moment. Healthy support in the upper part of the atmosphere. There's certainly a pretty strong area of vorticity, what we call vorticity. It refers to kind of a rotation in the upper part of the atmosphere. That helps to produce some upward motion down in the lower levels, which in turn supports surface low pressure. We have some snow on the northern edge here, maybe some pink, some sleet, and then some rain across the Midwest. And this will basically move in a west to east fashion from the Midwest into the mid-Atlantic region later today, and especially tonight, having an impact in D.C., Philadelphia, perhaps even all the way up to New York City. Well, here's in fact a look at the vorticity in the middle section of the atmosphere, the 500 millibar section of the atmosphere. And again, it leads to upward motion down at the surface level. And here it is right now, associated with that low out over the Midwest, and it holds together, slides to the east, and maybe even a little bit southeast by the overnight hours into early tomorrow. So it holds together, indicating that this low pressure area will certainly make its way across the Appalachian Mountains, and with that kind of support in the upper part of the atmosphere, there certainly will be some beneficial rainfall overnight tonight in the Mid-Atlantic region. In some areas, that rain will mix with or even be all snow for a while, especially north of the Pennsylvania-Maryland border. Now let's wrap up with the surface forecast maps using the 0Z run of the GFS, and here is the reflection at the surface of that surface low. Again, it has a lot of support in the upper part of the atmosphere. It'll head to the east today. Skies were clear this morning, portions of the I-95 corridor region. Clouds will thicken up in a hurry, and it is a cold and dry air mass. Dew points are way low. Temperatures are below normal for this time of the year. So when this precipitation arrives in the south central part of PA or the northern parts of Maryland and Virginia and West Virginia, there certainly can be enough evaporative cooling at the onset to allow for a drop in temperatures and some snow or sleet, at least mixed in here as the precipitation begins. This is a midday today forecast map. Then we go later in the day. Precipitation should push into the DC metro area by later in the afternoon, probably holding off until the evening hours, the after dark hours across southeastern PA. But it is at this time that upper level support really kind of helps to intensify that surface low, and the precipitation shield expands to the north. And certainly on the north side, primarily in those locations north of the Pennsylvania-Maryland border, may be cold enough for some snow to mix in, maybe even a little bit of accumulation, let's say I-80 north across central Pennsylvania, east central Pennsylvania. And again, there can be some snowflakes all the way down into southeastern PA mixing in here. Maybe in some of those far northern and western suburbs of Baltimore and D.C. could see a few ice pellets or snowflakes. And not a heavy rain event, but it's certainly a beneficial rain throughout the night tonight into the early morning hours on Wednesday, perhaps a half an inch total precipitation. D.C., Philadelphia, maybe less than that. in New York City, which will be kind of on the northeastern fringe of this particular low pressure system. By later Wednesday morning, it pulls on out and it remains dry and chilly in the mid-Atlantic region. So that's it for now. Long, extended video discussion this morning with a look ahead and a look at the current interesting near-term weather situation. That's it for now. For ArcfieldWeather.com, this has been meteorologist Paul Dorian.